Good evening and welcome to the second panel discussion of Global Cleveland's International Women's Month celebration. My name is Rosarita DeMillo and I currently serve as a graduate fellow for Global Cleveland. Our organization recognizes the incredible impact that international folks have on our Cleveland communities. From CEOs to healthcare workers, nonprofit directors to stay-at-home parents, international women are essential. Through our daily features, business highlights, and 3 panel discussions this month, we hope to remind our community that international women, women identifying, trans women, and non-binary folks deserve to be cherished, listened to, and celebrated. Thank you all for attending this panel today. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the recent and ongoing tragedies that international individuals are facing in our country and around the world. Global Cleveland stands united against racism and hate against our Asian American Pacific Islander community. The horrific surge in violence and hate crimes that is happening across our country is unacceptable, and we must work to stand in solidarity with our AAPI brothers and sisters. We condemn all forms of hate and are committed to rectifying racial inequalities in our society. Our hearts go out to the reported shootings of Asian women on Tuesday in Atlanta, for the victims' families, and for other victims of the hate crimes throughout the country and the entire AAPI community. Today, we are joined by the Immigrant and Refugee Coalition to End Sexual Violence through the HIMSA Department of Asian Services in Action. We will learn about the complexities of gender-based violence within international communities. The amazing individuals sitting on this panel today are experts in their fields, combining their experiences working in law and the nonprofit space with advocating for vulnerable populations. Thank you, Amanda, Samantha, and Suku.
Thank you so much, Rosarita, for that wonderful introduction. And I really want to thank you and everybody for giving a moment for the victims of this past shooting in Atlanta. There has been an increase in Asian American violence. And this is something that not only needs to be recognized, it really needs to be understood and acknowledged by the greater community of the types of pressures that not only the Asian community, but the immigrant and refugee community as a whole, as what they face on a day-to-day basis. So I appreciate the acknowledgement of that, Rosarita. So hi, everyone, I'm Samantha. I'm gonna be sharing my screen, so please give me a moment. So as explained by Rosarita, we're here to talk about gender-based violence in the immigrant and refugee communities. We represent the HIMSA Department at Asian Services in Action. So to do some little introductions, again, my name is Samantha Solomon. I'm the manager of the HIMSA Department and the supervising attorney with the Legal Services Department at Asian Services in Action.
Hi everyone, I am Amanda Smith. I am the Advocate Supervisor for our HIMSA Department at Asian Services in Action, as well as the lead host for our Immigrant Refugee Coalition, IROC, to end sexual violence.
Oh, Suku, I think you're on mute.
Okay. My technology. Okay, sorry about that. Hello, everyone. My name is Suku. I'm the bilingual advocate here in our HIMSA department at Asian Services in Action. A little bit about me is I'm from Nepal. I mostly work with Nepali community, including other community as well. And I've been working with ASA over 4 years now, helping survivors, domestic violence survivors, sexual assault, and human trafficking.
And Suku is a extremely valuable asset to our team. And we're really excited for you guys to hear from her today about her experience and her opinions on this situation. So a little bit of background about Asian Services in Action. We're also known as Asia Inc. This year, we're going to be celebrating our 25th anniversary as a nonprofit, which is a wonderful accomplishment. You know, Asia Inc. was developed by 4 Chinese women who came together when they were new to America and recognized that the struggles the immigrant community, the Asian immigrant community had in understanding how to just do basic everyday things in the community, in terms of how to find a job, how to file for taxes, a lot of things that people who are born and raised in America, we take for granted. And so they came together and they started this nonprofit, which is Asia Inc. And it just flourished from there. And now we are a much bigger agency, which I think Suku's going to talk a little bit about.
Okay, so about Asia, we have like 8 different departments. So it's mostly based for refugees, immigrants, people who can walk into our door. There's like, they can get service from our agency for all ages, from young, like toddler to like elder, middle-aged and elder people. So the services we provide is, we have our HIMSA department, which we provide services for domestic violence, sexual assaults, and human trafficking survivors. And also we have AA service, which they basically help for the elderly people. They because they are from their different cultures, since they're lonely, they're not like familiar with the community, like Americans lifestyle, so they feel lonely at home, so they have these services for them to engage and like have meet friends, and to like basically to interact to each other. And also we have interpreting and translated departments, civic engagement, and we also have a legal services. Also we also have in clinic.
So as Suka and Samantha mentioned, Asia as a whole is really, trying to make sure immigrant and refugee populations have somewhere they can go with a, no wrong door policy. We want to provide this holistic care. And our department in particular is also very, very big and based on holistic care and trauma-informed approach. So everyone within our department specifically is trained in being trauma-informed for our clients, whether that's on the legal services side or the advocacy side. And we do this so that when the clients that come through our door, most of the time, they're already feeling very vulnerable, and now they're dealing with either domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, sometimes a combination of the 3. So we really want to make them feel welcome and knowing that they have a place to come to. So between the advocacy and the legal services, they're usually assigned one legal attorney for all aspects that they're needing to go through, whether it's, immigration concerns, they need a divorce from their perpetrator, maybe there's some custody issues going on. That way there is one attorney who can understand, and that way they don't have to tell their story to multiple different people. And to follow up with that, they usually also have the same advocate for all of the services they're needing. So we work together hand in hand to make sure that the clients we're serving get the best services possible. And there are some listed of kind of what we can do for our survivors.
So the question becomes is, why are we harping so much on the immigrant and refugee communities? And why are our services so necessary? As you can tell, Ohio has many different cultures and many different individuals practicing many different religions. It's a beautiful thing. And while, as you can see on the Ohio population chart, that the majority of people in Ohio are white, we do have a good portion who are of minority communities. And by minority communities, I'm talking about the African-American community, the refugee community, the immigrant community, and many, many more. Because most people, when you think about minority communities, you think about white in color of the skin, but also there are minorities in the different religions that you practice. And what's a really cool fact that we wanted to make sure everybody knew is that today, nearly 1/3 of in Ohio's population of every child under the age of 1 is from or belongs to a minority community, which is a beautiful thing, absolutely beautiful thing. But this just increases the idea that our type of services are very necessary. The idea of being trauma informed in a cultural humility way.
So, we've kind of talked about, why it's so important that we talk about this and why we need to take a step further and look at gender-based violence and what this looks like. Because gender-based violence is a very real thing and it happens in all communities. And like I kind of touched on earlier, specifically within the immigrant and refugee populations, this can be even harder. And we're going to kind of get into this as we go out through the presentation. And why that this sometimes is harder to find the services needed to figure out where they can go for help. And for those of you who don't know, I've kind of put the definition of what gender-based violence actually is, because it is directed at an individual, usually based on their gender identity or their biological sex. And this includes a various amount of things, whether it's physical violence, it could be sexual violence, emotional, verbal, psychological, they could be coerced, they have threats, any economic, educational, immigration status is another one. And this is either in a public setting or even in a private setting. And gender-based violence, it is something that we need to have the most education on to be able to help our neighbors, our friends, our brothers, our sisters, because at some point, whether we know it or not, someone in our lives has experienced gender-based violence. And I'm going to have one of the global Cleveland panelists pull up a poll just to kind of gauge our knowledge about some myths or facts. So if you kind of want to go through these and just kind of determine if you think this is a myth or a fact. So I'll give everyone a couple more minutes and then I will have them share the results.
Did we get everyone's answer?
And then if someone from Global Cleveland could just share the results whenever they've gotten the results. Perfect, thank you. So I kind of wanted to kind of look at these because I think it is important as we talk today to kind of recognize the myths or facts of gender-based violence, because there's a lot of educational pieces out there or just some things that we may not know are occurring. And so I think it's important to kind of understand, what actually is a fact about domestic violence, sexual violence, human trafficking. What are some myths? Because I think there's just so much circulating, whether it's in the news, TV, social media, and just making sure that we're educated on exactly what these issues are and kind of what is actually true and what is actually not true. And it sounds like everyone for the first one, all agree that that's not true. It is not easy to leave a domestic violence situation. There's a lot of different nuances that go into why it can be hard to leave, why it's not as easy as just picking up your bag and walking out of a situation. And then for this next one, someone's culture or religion does not need to be considered when giving services to a survivor. I think generally a lot of people also said that this is a myth. It is something that needs to be considered, because for a lot of people, whether it's their culture or religion, there may be nuances to that as to why they feel they can't leave that perpetrator, which is why we need to have that discussion with them and really dive deep into, okay, what's going to happen if you leave this perpetrator? Maybe they're afraid of being, kicked out of their community that they're in, or they're afraid that their family's going to turn their backs on them, or that their church or their place of worship is not going to welcome them back if they leave the person that is harming them. And then we kind of had mixed range for the third one. It does take an average of 7 times before someone does leave an abusive situation for good. And as some of you may be aware or may not be aware, a lot of times it can be very hard to leave a perpetrator of either domestic violence, sexual violence, human trafficking, and specifically in domestic violence, this is the case because it can be very hard to leave. And then, maybe they say, oh, I'm going to change, I promise. And then they go back, and it can be really hard. And so we're going to kind of talk about some of the things that we see within gender-based violence. And then the last one, everyone, agrees, this happens in every type of setting, whether rich or poor, whether you're from a suburban or rural area, it could be neighbors, families, friends, even ourselves, which is why it's so important we talk about gender-based violence today, and why we're diving even deeper into how gender-based violence affects our immigrant and refugee populations.
Okay, so what GBV looks like at Ahimsa. We have several different types of clients come to us we have worked with in the past. One very most common is domestic violence, which includes physical abuse, financial, emotional, and verbal abuse. Sometimes sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is also very common, but a lot of our clients, especially refugees and immigrants client, they don't want to talk about the sexual violence that much. But as we started to work with those clients, they slowly disclose, but it will take for them to disclose those type of things. And human trafficking, labor, and sex, those are the this type of client we worked on our daily basis.
So now, when you understand why the Ahimsa department sees the clients that we do, you can then appreciate how and why culture and religion impact gender-based violence. But we got to understand what those terms actually mean. And the main term that I want to focus on is the idea of culture. And what exactly culture is. This is a nuance that a lot of people don't or have a difficult time understanding and grasping how vast the term culture actually is. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a poll.
I'm going to share my screen here in a second so everyone can see the answers. But Sam, can you pull that back up for just a second so people can see where they need to type?
I am going to put it in the chat.
Okay, Sam's going to put it in the chat. So I just kind of want to get everyone's perspective on some words or phrases as to what they think culture is. So this can be, one word answers, couple word answers, and you can either text it in or go to the link she is sending. So if everyone just kind of wants to, and it's again at the top of my screen as well, you can either go to that link or you can text 2233, and then in the little chat box of the text, you'd put Amanda Smith 841. And then that will allow you to text in your responses of what culture means to you, what culture is. Shared values, that's a good one. Family. Food is also a very good one. But we have a lot of people that have said food. And I also think, it also gives time for people to come together. when sharing food. Religion, that's another good one. Language. So I'll give everyone a couple more minutes and feel free to put a couple in. But so far, I think everyone's kind of hit the nail on the head about what a culture is. Comment ideas. All right, so I think people have kind of had a time to put some of what they think culture is. I know Saban's going to dive deeper into this, so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Thank you everyone for participating.
All right. Now that we've been able to kind of get a better understanding from you guys what your belief of culture is, let's learn a little bit about the big picture of culture. So the term culture is an umbrella term. It can describe characteristics of a particular group, which encompasses social norms, beliefs, systems, languages, habits of individuals. And we actually, this culture wheel is what we typically present when we look at all the aspects of culture, but these aren't all of them by no means. This is actually just encompassing a little bit about what is mostly identified as culture. So we have knowledge and stories. How many cultures are based upon the verbal word of stories? It's actually quite beautiful. That's particularly in the Middle Eastern community. They're very known for their stories that they hand down from one generation to the next. Language is very, very important, and you'll understand that this is a huge barrier a lot of our clients struggle with each day. Traditions and rituals, how weddings are, what you do for funerals, techniques and skills, tools and objects, the arts. We actually really cool. We just went to the art museum last week as a team, and just to see the different arts from various places throughout the world is absolutely beautiful. You get to understand their culture a little bit more in depth. Their food and what their drinks are, what their values are, what their religion is. There's so many different ways you can look at it, but the idea is that culture is everything. It truly is. And it creates all the culture in an individual situation will help determine and will impact their decision-making skills, which is the importance and why this presentation is so incredibly important to understand. So when you're learning about culture, there's only so much we can do because we're never going to be experts. So I'm going to hand it over to Suku to talk a little bit about what cultural humility actually is.
Okay, what is cultural humility? So when you talk about the cultural humility, you are like basically being humble and respectful towards some others individuals' culture. So just understanding their culture, and also it's a learning process. It's a life learning process. You are not expert in the culture because you're not from that culture, right? So it's just like just trying to learn about that culture. So next slide, please. So what's the difference between cultural humility and the cultural competency? Where I already talked about cultural humility, that telling the client you work with, like telling them you are the expert, they are the expert, and then you're just trying to learn about their culture and seize the culture, and also like try to learn about their culture and understand. Whereas cultural competency is, they are the expert. So where requires answers, right? Like asking, like someone else asking the person, and then the person will be able to answer the questions. And also it is statistic, like, yeah, it's kind of like permanent. They don't want to change their culture or their language where they came from. Yeah, next slide.
And the idea is cultural competency is saying that you can be completely competent about somebody's culture. And that, by definition, understanding the complexity of culture. This is a very old term. Most people, when they're talking about trying to learn about culture, they used to say, I want training on cultural competency. But that terminology in and of itself does not actually depict what you're trying to inquire about, because you're never going to be experts in other cultures. Never. The only people who are experts about someone's culture is that individual and that individual alone. So the idea is it's a different mentality. It's the thought that I don't understand your culture, but I want to learn. Cultural humility requires questions. It requires you asking questions, while cultural competency is saying, I know why they're doing that. I get it because I know and I'm competent in that. But that's never the situation. So then we go back to, how is gender-based violence impacted by culture and religion? Well, when you're looking at various cultures, particularly from the immigrant and refugee communities, which is what we're focusing on, a lot of the cultures that we interact with are very patriarchal. There is a hierarchy in the household, and the men is the ones who make the final decisions, whether those decisions dealing with financial decisions, whether they're dealing with medical decisions, legal decisions. There is this hierarchy that you must abide by. Now, is this in every culture? No. But these are things that we have to take in consideration, particularly when working with the communities that we work with. Another huge way that culture impacts gender-based violence and what we work with is the power of the community. Being from America, we're a very independent society. We're very independent oriented, self-oriented, self-determined, however you want to identify that as. Whereby a lot of the communities that we work with are actually community oriented or family oriented. They think their decisions not only impact them, but it impacts their family and their community. And so before making decisions, they have to explain, or they have to ask for, not necessarily maybe permission to certain people, but at least everybody come to the table and everyone everyone comes together to talk about these major decisions before the decision is actually made. So the community puts a lot of pressure on individuals to abide by their community and stay within their community. And with these communities, a lot of these communities have what we identify as community leaders, who are individuals. They might be religious oriented or not, but they're individuals in the community that are very well respected. These are the individuals that you go to when you have questions or when you have concerns or when you need assistance or guidance or advice on something. A lot of the communities that we focus on, they have these community leaders, and they're integral when working with survivors. And then we also have various religious perspectives coming in. Even when you're looking at, the three major religions of, Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, every individual has a different perspective on that religion. That's where the idea of culture comes in. Even when you're looking at a culture, the religious perspective of somebody's culture. Just because they're Christian doesn't mean they believe in X, Y, or Z, or they're Catholic. There are multiple sects, or there's multiple denominations of most religions. So being able to understand from the individual, the survivor's perspective of what their religion means to them is extremely important in helping them make decisions. So when looking at other additional challenges that we face with a lot of our clients, We're looking at probably the most noted one is immigration status. The majority of our clients are not US citizens. And when you are a non-US citizen, any legal action that you can take most likely will have an impact on your immigration status. So being able to identify that that might be a barrier before you can provide services to a survivor. Very important. Another thing that we take in consideration, which are a little bit unique when working with these communities, is the fact that a lot of our clients do not have the knowledge or do not have access to our legal system and understanding how it works. I can't tell you how many times we've had a client that came to us and they said they called the police, but they can't speak English. The client can't speak English, and the police went to the house of the survivor, and the police wanted to talk to the perpetrator only because that is the only individual that spoke English. And then understanding the role of the police and the authority figures is very important. Language access is a huge barrier in a lot of the services our clients try to take advantage of. We're very blessed to have a lot of the services that we do, but there aren't many agencies that provide language access services. And because there aren't a lot of them, there tends to be a lot of conflict of interest. There tends to be a lot of community members that are trying to help their community. But when it's one person in the community versus another person, that tends to be a conflict with the interpreter themselves. And again, dealing with knowledge of the services available to them. Transportation is a huge issue. Again, being very community oriented. A lot of people rely upon one another for things such as transportation. And when you are a survivor and you want to get out of that situation, sometimes those resources such as transportation go with them. And then again, I said fear of the authority. That could be the police, that could be the courts, that could be talking to attorneys. Because the idea of where these individuals came from and what these individuals did in their home country that identified themselves as the police, that identified themselves as the courts or lawyers, and they took advantage of a lot of people. So understanding the survivor's perspective of authority figures. And last but not least, shelters tend to be a huge struggle for a lot of our clients because of access to food that they actually would eat. Access to, again, language barriers, and then access to when you have children in shelters and being able to practice your own religion or practice your own culture within them.
So thank you, Sam. So Sam talked about a lot of the unique challenges that the immigrant and refugee survivors we are helping face. So what can we do as a community, as advocates, as, you know, in social work, in whatever area we're working in, there's something we all can do. So one thing, no matter what we're doing, how we're interacting with people who have been survivors of gender-based violence, is we need to start by believing. That is one of the biggest things that is going to make a difference, and not victim blaming. You know, I think as a society, we are starting to educate ourselves more about, you know, especially when it comes to sexual violence, it really doesn't matter what someone's wearing. You know, most of the time, people aren't wearing the quote unquote outfits that people think of when, oh, someone's been sexually assaulted. So it's important not to victim blame. You know, we need to start by believing them. And then when it comes to immigrant, refugee, minority groups who are not from here, educating them on how the process works here, whether it's, you know, educating them on the fact that they don't need consent from both parties to get divorced in the United States, because for a lot of countries and areas, that is something that, you know, they have to have. Or educating them on, you know, just the different processes, the legal processes, you know, how to interact with police, what the police do, what, you know, the difference between calling for a fire department, calling for police, calling for, you know, an emergency situation, like calling 911. So just educating and seeing where the survivor's at and helping them kind of navigate the systems. And then it's also important to understand the myths and facts regarding gender-based violence. You know, that's important because we need to understand, you know, like I kind of talked about, it doesn't matter what someone's wearing. If a perpetrator is going to sexually assault someone, they're going to sexually assault someone. But how can we stop that? How can we, as a community, look at that and say enough is enough? And it's really just starting by believing the survivors and being there and being in their corner and supporting them. And understanding how barriers to service can affect that survivor, understanding how the language barrier can affect them reaching out, understanding their fear of authority, how that could affect them from, you know, reaching out for help or calling 911, and figuring out different ways to help them that they're comfortable with. And then, like we've kind of talked about, we need to do things in a cultural, humble way. Be comfortable with the uncomfortable. You know, we don't know everything, and you don't know what you don't know. So sometimes we do need to ask questions and get to the bottom of things and figure out how we can best help someone. And again, remember that they are the expert, not us, when it comes to their culture and how that affects things. So just really talking to them and learning about their culture and learning how that can affect just the different nuances of how, you know, they face the gender-based violence they have been dealing with. And again, just be open to learning about how their religion could also affect these services. One example of this that I have is I was working with a client when I worked for a rape crisis center who did not want to take the prophylaxis because it was against their religion, and understanding that. And the nurse was like, what the heck? No, you really need to take this. And just advocating for them, be like, you know, and just explaining to someone that may not know, like the nurse didn't know that that was like a thing for that religion. She just explained, you know, their religion, they're not about this. Is there something else that this client could do to kind of help this situation? Or is there a different form of treatment or something that we could do? And just kind of getting creative and understanding that not everyone is going to react the same way and not everyone wants to go the same way.
And again, I think the big idea of what we're trying to explain is that what you might think is common sense, or what you might think is, oh yeah, well, of course, typically isn't like that. One client that I had, and actually Amanda was working with me with this client, she was from Indonesia. And for those of you that don't know, that is a Muslim-based country. But she was actually a very devout Christian. And she married an individual here who claimed to be a very devout Christian. And her abuse, amongst others, was religious abuse. And he would use scripture against her. And it was very interesting because a lot of the things that she was quoting from the Bible are things that most people, if you were to read it, you wouldn't really think out of context. Like when you learn more about the holistic idea of what that provision means in the Bible, that it's not as harsh as what it comes out of being. But she believed that quote, and that's what her abuse was based upon, is that one line in the Bible. And so it's very intriguing. How different situations can result and what the nuances of each case could bring. So that being said, we wanted to go through a few of our cases that we have dealt with in the Ahimsa department at Asia, and kind of help get a better perspective of what it looks like when we're actually working through a case with clients and how complicated it could get. So we're going to first hand it off to Suku to talk about one of her clients.
Okay, the case number one. This is actually my client. I have been working with her since 2018. So since then, she's still one of our active clients here. We're still helping her. So I'm just gonna start with reading off her story from the screen. So this client married to her husband, who is a US citizen from her community. In 2017, he brought her to the US. After a few months she arrived here, he started to abuse her physically and sexually. She did not speak any English to seek help, and also not knowing of consequences for her immigration status if she were to get help from the outsider. She chose to remain silent and continue to tolerate the abuse. After a year, she got a job at the factory where she met a friend from her community, and she shared her story with her. One day, her husband came home drunk and forced her to strip her clothes. When she refused to do that, he threatened to chop her body into pieces and throw it into the dumpster. And also, he told her that if she called the cops, they will deport her. She hid in the bathroom and called her work friend, and then her work friend called me to see how we can help her. So we'll talk about it, like what are the issues, like we had to, how we were able to help her.
So we want to get some idea of what you guys, after hearing it, I'm going to actually go back to the last slide so you guys can look at the facts again. What are some issues that you see in this case that you feel that we might have to have dealt with when working with this client? So please enter it into the chat, and Amanda's going to be telling us what the chat's saying, what everyone's saying in there. So here are the case facts.
So someone had mentioned language access. Immigration status concerns.
Mm-hmm.
Someone else had said it sounds like he married her to maybe help her gain her citizenship. Understanding her rights as a victim.
These are some good answers, but they're going to get much more complicated, guys. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through how we actually were able to help her.
Someone else said physical fear and retaliation as well.
Mm-hmm.
Perpetrator increasing fear of law enforcement, not understanding the abuse. Those are also very good.
All right, Suku, you want to talk a little bit about what actually happened with this case?
Yes. So once I found out about her situation, I found out that she didn't speak any English, so there is no way that she could call the cops. And also because of her immigration status, that she was scared to call the cops. Even I offered her that I could help you to call the cops. She was like, no, what if I get arrested or they will deport me after that? That's what my husband told me. So it was, that's when I was like, oh no, like, what do I do now? So I had to contact attorney, which is Samantha. I contacted her to get the, like, what if it is safe to call the cops or not. And then after that, I got the clarification from Sam that it is safe to call the cops for her. So I called the cops. After that there is an option to go to the shelter, but she didn't have a transportation. And then but thankfully the police officer he offered her to take her to the shelter. So even she go to the shelter, there is a language barrier. So like she didn't speak any English. So I had to be there for her. I mean, technically, normally the shelters use a language line to do an intake, but it was like she was in fear. Basically she was fear of everything. Cops, also she didn't know what would be the intake at the shelter, like what would they do, those are the things. So I had to be there to support her and explain the situation, explain the process. And then after that, her husband still did not stop to contact her. Like he was basically calling nonstop and threatening her. So we started to take the next step, filing for CPO. CPO is not common in overseas where we came from. Divorce is common, but CPO, there is not an option to file for protection order to get protect from the abuser. So I had to explain to her in detail, like what the CPO is, like what she, after she got the CPO, what would be the case, like she'll be able to protect from him, stuff like that. So I had to explain the process, including that I had to write a narrative when I went to help her to file for protection order because of the language barrier. After that, we were able to get a CPO, and then there was we started to talk about the divorce, and then explain the divorce. The divorce system is completely, not completely, I would say it's slightly different than here than overseas, where we came from. When you file for the divorce, if husband refused to give the sign on the divorce paper, there won't be divorce. Divorce won't finalize in Nepal. So she was fear of that. I had to explain to her, she can file for divorce. So without him, she would still be able to get the divorce from him and stuff like that. There was also another issue about immigration concerns, because since she came here on technically undependent on him, like everything she had to depend on him. There is she didn't have any documents here. Those are the issues that we had to face. If you want to talk about it, Sam, about the immigration that we were.
Sure. So this client, when she came over here, she came on a fiance visa with her husband. And then she applied for the next step, which is called a conditional residency visa, which is a 2-year green card. For those of you that don't know, the green card is the card that actually shows that you're lawfully allowed to live here. The problem that we struggled with is that she immediately started experiencing the abuse, and this particular incident occurred very shortly after she came to the United States. So she got the 2-year green card, which was based upon her marriage to this individual, which he understood and he took advantage of her for. This was just one incident of abuse that she experienced. It is actually quite extensive of abuse that she had to deal with. But that last threat that he made, which still haunts me to this day as an attorney, she genuinely believed that he could cut her body into multiple pieces and throw it throughout Akron and dumpsters. And so from an immigration perspective, her visa dependency was based upon her marriage. Well, we were filing for divorce and we were getting a protection order against him, which contradicts the idea of her getting the green card. So it was very difficult, that a thing that we had to overcome. And we're still actually, unfortunately, in the process for this, of trying to get her to remain in the United States lawfully. So then on top of that, we were trying to help with job access. Suku?
So these are the different issues that we had to brainstorm for her to help. So another thing is helping her to find a job. So when she was living with her husband, he basically told her that if she leave him, she will not be able to get a job, or she will not be able to obtain the work permit and stuff like that. And including that, on the top of that, she doesn't know how to drive. She doesn't have a car. So those are the the issues that we had to like figure out how to help her. So I was able to find her a job where she can carpool, like where there is other people from her community working in the same company, so she can carpool with. They will take her, they will provide her transportation, including like applying for public housing. So she was making minimum income, so she couldn't afford to live by herself. So I thought about helping her the public housing. When I thought about it, when I was trying to help her, I also have to think like, what if she will get a public charge, stuff like that. And so I also had to consult with Samantha, attorney Samantha, and then we were even, she got accepted at the emergency housing, but she would be public charge, like there was possibility she would get deported. So we had to deny that and start another route, helping her try to find the apartment in the community where she will be able to get access of different resources like transportation or like language access. She didn't have any friends here. I mean, she didn't have any friends and family here. So I had to help her where there is a lot of Nepali communities, so she can have company or language access. Also the groceries that she can get her type of food in that community in North area. So yeah.
You know, the thing is numbers 1 through 8 occurred about within 2 weeks. I would say number 1 through 7 occurred within 3 or 4 days after a major trauma that she went through. Understanding trauma-informed care and understanding how trauma can impact one's brain in terms of memory, in terms of comprehension. On top of that, now we're dealing with an individual that doesn't understand how our legal system works. They don't have the language access to everyday things. All of these things make the process of helping the immigrant and refugee communities even more difficult. And these are complications that we have to deal with every single day.
And one follow-up question that we do have that was in our question and answers was someone asked, did she lose her immigration status after the divorce?
No. So what we did was we requested a waiver through the immigration so that she could get her 10-year green card without her husband because of the abuse that she experienced in their marriage. But right now, we are still in that process of trying to figure out and trying to finalize that process. That was, again, almost 3 years ago that we started with this client. And this is how long things process, how long it takes sometimes. And so actually moving forward onto our next scenario, which Amanda is going to be covering, we'll see this is how even more long it could be.
Yes. So, and then one thing, somebody else just mentioned in the chat too is, memory recollection due to trauma is a huge problem in immigration court. And that's very true. It's a huge problem in immigration court, through criminal court, especially when there is that language barrier on top of that can even make it even harder too. So moving into case 2, client B came to us, came to the US on a visiting visa, fleeing from her abusive husband. In her country, being LGBTQ+ is considered a crime. Her husband repeatedly reported to their government about this to try and get her in trouble when she would not feel like having sexual relationships with him. Client B came here to visit a friend and is terrified of going back. Since then, her visiting visa has expired, and the person she has been staying with has not been treating her right. She cannot work and cannot return to her country. So what issues and problems do we see? So if people want to kind of type this in the chat, like, what do you think would be an issue? What do you think are some ways we could try to help? But then, is there issues with that? So if people just want to kind of type it in the chat. I'm just going to give a couple minutes for this one because I know we're about 5 minutes to 7. So I'm just going to give about another minute. And then we'll kind of dive into the issues of actually what actually happened with this client. Someone else mentioned if officials have no empathy or understanding how memory is affected and they are punished because of it in the court system. That is very true. Someone else said she is currently illegally here, which would be an immigration concern. Give everyone just a couple more minutes. She can't earn any money. That's another good point. Okay, Sam, if you want to move to the next slide, just so that we can kind of talk about this a little bit. Yeah, so thankfully we were able to get, she can't leave and she can't really go. She's stuck. That's a very good point. So she was able to get in contact with us and was able to talk with an advocate and an immigration attorney about her concerns. So her immigration status concerns, she's currently waiting on status. We were able to kind of get the application for asylum started for her. So we're just kind of in limbo right now, waiting for that to go through. But that does raise a concern as she still can't, really work or do anything at the current moment. She doesn't have transportation, so that was a huge concern in how getting her from place to place. She was staying with a friend who actually started being almost like a perpetrator in a sense, and was withholding food from her, because she couldn't work, she would tell the client, oh, well, you have to do all the chores, you have to do all the cooking, the cleaning, everything. And if the client didn't do something or she forgot to do something, food was withheld from her, and it was not a good situation anymore. So we had to get her into DV shelter. And the reason why I have this highlighted was because it was important for us to check with the shelter. What do they do if do they ask for status? Do they ask, if someone has their paperwork or their green cards with them? Like, is that something they ask for? Will they report them to the immigration enforcement agency? So just kind of talking and making sure our DV shelter doesn't do that. And thankfully ours does not. And we've really worked hand in hand very closely with that caseworker to make sure that they're not trying to apply her for things to help her become self-sufficient that would end up hurting her immigration stuff. So we can't really apply for housing yet until the immigration status is kind of fixed and handled. And then the religious and cultural issues that were based around this, not being able to go back to her country, where she could have got persecuted. And I'm sorry, a DV shelter is a domestic violence shelter. We use a lot of acronyms in the nonprofit area, so I apologize. But yeah, so a domestic violence shelter that's specifically for anyone who's been a survivor of domestic violence. So yeah, that's just a little bit about what's going on. I did put a little bit of an update on there. So we're just kind of waiting for that status with the asylum to get handled, and then we can really start looking into a permanent shelter for her, finding jobs, etc., to help with her sustainability to be able to stay here.
So for those of you that aren't very familiar with immigration and how it works, I had a client that was waiting close to 10 years for asylum, for even the case to be adjudicated, to be looked at, and to be given a decision. Now, that varies by state typically. Ohio typically is not that long, but the fact of the matter is that these cases can take a very extensive period of time. And so we have to be careful when we're dealing with these type of clients and how we're going to be working with them.
So thank you everyone for joining us. I know we're almost at 7. I hope everyone was able to take something away from, what occurs in gender-based violence, how it affects the immigrant and refugee community, how it can really affect anyone that we come in contact with, and how it's just important to educate ourselves, ask questions, be open to learning new things. And if you guys if anyone needs to talk further, has any further questions, I've put our hotline number on here. And then we do have an IROC coalition that meets the first Friday of every month from 9:30 to 10:30, where we talk about different issues within immigrant and refugee populations when it comes to sexual violence. And I've put my email there as well if anyone wants to join those calls, or that email can also be used if you have any questions in general about what we've talked about today with you.
Thank you so much to the IROC committee for sharing and educating us on the complexities of gender-based violence in international communities. I think we know that it's so important that intersectional advocacy is crucial to protect and uplift the most vulnerable members of our community. And thank you to our audience today for your desire to learn from the experiences that may be unique to your own. As part of our International Women's Month celebration, we have one more panel on LGBTQ+ identities within international communities. Please see our website, globalcleveland.org, to register and to learn more about the international women that we are featuring daily. Thank you all for your support of Global Cleveland and for your support of our entire newcomer community. Global Cleveland believes that we strengthen our city by welcoming the world. Thank you so much to everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone.